Hello everyone, how's it going? I decided to stop procrastinating today and finally go to the hardware store. I've been meaning to work on this envelope generator for a while, but I just didn't have big enough drill bits. But now there's no excuse. So for this envelope generator, I'm using a schematic provided by Look Mum No Computer, which will probably save a couple weeks instead of trying to figure out for myself. But what's also great is I already had the IC chip needed, as well as all the other components. I think the only thing I was really waiting on was to get these push buttons delivered, and of course that drill bit. But then of course I shelved it because I believe I should have made the oscillator first. But here we are now. So I just want to get started with a little bit of planning. Of course I have the Synthrotech blank Eurorack panel, and probably a little bit more room than I need, but at this point I'm still using these cheap 1/4-inch jacks that I have, and I don't want to bother with cramming anything. It's not like I'm trying to save space. So the main attraction here is going to be this push button, sort of like a manual trigger for the envelope. So that's going to be nice and centered, and I'm going to try and keep some of the other components away from it. Now, I'm still a little bit new to the game, so maybe I don't know the proper way to orient things, but to me, I think this is going to sit on the right-hand side of my synth, and so I'm going to have my CV in and envelope out jacks to the left, and I'm going to have my knobs to the right. And then lastly, have my LED centered a little bit above the push button, and on switch right next to it. Yeah, so I'll go and get that drilled out now. Well, that was pretty quick and painless. It turned out relatively okay. I'm using the same size that I used for the oscillator. I end up using a unibit, I believe, and actually came out very smooth compared to using my regular drill bits. So that's pretty nice. Gives me all the way from 1/2 inch to a whole inch. So I'll get started on populating this. So that was pretty easy to populate. I do have some gripes about where I put the on switch. I feel like it's a little bit close to this button. I could just found a different place. And I wanted to use these knobs for the attack and release instead of these crappier ones, but I mean, this is fine. I sort of got the style going on here compared to my oscillator. First, I start off on some of the initial soldering, just sort of trying to get an idea of where I want to put everything. At this point, I realized I had my hand blocking the camera while I was trying to solder. That's fine, because you can still at least see Bell. After I have the cable input soldered, I start cutting the strips on the strip board. Skipping ahead, I'm mounting the components and checking the schematic, just making sure everything's right and makes sense. I'm not quite the soldering expert, but I have a few years of experience. And what I do is I usually have my heat cranked all the way up, and that just seems to be what everybody else does. You sort of get a feel for the solder, and you tend to do things quickly, if you can. I usually tend to avoid soldering too many components at once, because as you can see, the wires are sort of crossing over and getting soldered into spots they shouldn't be, so I'm constantly having to move them. Soldering on strip board has been quite different from PCBs or proto board. At this point, once I got the bulk of the strip board soldered, I'm trying to find a nice way to mount it onto the front panel. And here, I make the stupid mistake of cutting more into the strip board, which I'll have to fix later. As you could probably guess, it's easy to get carried away when you're trying to make small adjustments to an already established schematic. But as long as you can sort of follow the path of logic, you'll be able to figure it out and fix your mistakes later. Although what I'm doing here might just be a bad idea. You see, I'm soldering the output jacks straight onto the strip board, so the strip board has some place to be stable on, but it's probably bad for those solder joints. But it could just be laziness because I don't want to glue it and wait for it. One thing I tend to do when I'm soldering on strip board is check the connectivity between the strips to make sure solder is not flowing over and connecting strips that shouldn't be connected. And now that I'm nearing the end of the build, I'm working on the wires between the pots and the jacks. I typically do this last just because it's a lot of wire over everything else, and it really sucks when you miss something on the strip board because you have to try and finagle it in there. And as you can see, I'm kind of struggling right now. But other than making simple mistakes, which ended up in simple fixes, this build wasn't that bad. It's a good schematic. And at this point, with my experience, there's not really much I can sort of screw up without being able to figure out what's going on. So these projects really become sort of like an exercise in Zen for me, where I'm just focusing on the schematic and soldering, listen to a video in the background, just chilling. And you get the satisfaction of building something and, adding another tool to your arsenal. And lastly here, just some final checks with connectivity before I plug it in. Alright, and we're done. Only took me about 4 hours. So let's get this thing hooked up and test it out. Alright, so now I have the envelope generator screwed in next to the oscillator that I built last time. So we'll turn this on and we'll plug this in. So that's working as usual. I'm going to go into the CV in here. I'll plug into the envelope generator. Now, so we have two controls here, attack and release. So we have short bursts, or we can have a tail off at the end, or we can have long attack. And that's pretty much it. Well, it certainly is very nice. We can work off a schematic instead of trying to build something from scratch. But yeah, I'm happy with it. It does what it's supposed to. It's envelope generator. But I really feel like building it really made me understand what's going on in synthesis. And now I have a much better understanding of how to acquire these sounds as opposed to just buying a bunch of modules and trying to learn from there. But yeah, a big thank you to Look Mum No Computer for having basically all this stuff available on his website. I'll link everything down below. Yeah, of course, some Google searches for some other small stuff. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to put out something soon. Maybe some sort of MIDI keyboard or sequencer or low-pass filter. Who knows? Good night.